Ever get that feeling? Like you're trying to understand something big, something important in healthcare.
Like the science behind a new treatment.
Exactly. Or maybe just how those healthcare decisions even get made.
And you realize so much boils down to these things called clinical trials.
And it hits you. We're
Yeah.
trying to make sense of it all, but it feels like a puzzle.
A puzzle with way too many pieces.
And they're all weirdly shaped. Well, today, we're going to simplify that puzzle.
Think of us as your guides. We're going to walk you through the world of how clinical trials are actually regulated.
And you know what's great? You send over some really helpful material.
A transcript about cGCP, that's current good clinical practice.
Perfect. In this deep dive, we're going to unpack all of this regulatory stuff.
We'll break down the key things you absolutely need to know.
Yeah, to understand how they make sure these clinical trials are safe.
And high quality.
Absolutely. No law degree needed.
Just the essential insights.
So where do we even start with all of this?
Big picture first. Who are the main players? We'll talk about the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration here in the U.S.
They're definitely a central authority.
For sure. We'll also touch on the European Medicines Agency.
The EMA.
Right. And of course, the World Health Organization.
The WHO. The global player.
Absolutely. Then we'll look at these super important international guidelines.
Oh.
Specifically, the ICH guidelines.
I've heard of those, especially ICH E6R2.
You got it. That one's crucial. Finally, we'll step back and look at the history. How did all these regulations come to be?
How they've changed over time.
Exactly. And how they all fit together to create a worldwide system. A system focused on making clinical trials ethical.
Keeping participants safe.
And making sure they get good, solid data.
Okay, that makes sense. But why even have all these regulations in the first place? I mean, what's the core reason for such strict oversight of clinical trials?
That's the big question, isn't it? To really get it, we got to take a quick trip back in time, back to the early 1900s.
Okay, back in time we go.
Back then, the rules around drugs, they were pretty minimal.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, that was like the first step.
What did that one do?
It stopped companies from selling stuff that was mislabeled,
Okay, that makes sense.
or if the product itself was impure.
Makes sense.
But even with the 1912 Shirley Amendment,
What was that all about?
well, that was supposed to make it easier to prove a company was making false claims about what a drug could do.
Oh, so like lying about what the drug did?
Yeah, but proving it was still super hard.
Oh, wow. So back then it was kind of a buyer beware situation.
Pretty much. Companies could make all sorts of promises.
And get away with it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Until this really awful thing happened.
Uh-oh. What happened?
The 1937 sulfanilamide tragedy. It was terrible.
What happened?
There was this company, right? And they wanted to make a liquid form of sulfanilamide.
Sulfanilamide, what is that?
It was an antibiotic. So to make it liquid, they dissolved it in diethylene glycol.
Ethylene glycol. That doesn't sound familiar.
Well, it's highly toxic, like super dangerous. It's used in antifreeze.
Seriously.
Yeah. And this product, the liquid sulfanilamide, it ended up killing over 100 people.
Oh my gosh, that's just heartbreaking.
And so many of them were children. It was just awful.
I can see why something like that would immediately make people say, we need much stricter rules.
Absolutely. That event was a huge turning point. It made everyone realize it wasn't enough to just stop false claims.
Yeah. You had to prove the drug was safe before it could even be sold.
Exactly.
That's a huge shift. And that's what we still see today, right?
Right. That tragedy led directly to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
That's a big one.
Oh, yeah. For the very first time, a law said new drugs, you got to prove they're safe to the FDA.
Before they can go on the market.
Before they can go on the market. It was a big deal. Really the foundation for how we regulate drugs today.
So that act was like the bedrock. What happened after that?
Well, things kept developing. In 1944, the Public Health Service Act came along.
What did that one focus on?
That one was all about biological products, things like vaccines.
Okay.
And blood products, too.
Right.
Then, in 1951, we got the Durham-Humphrey Amendments.
What did those do?
Those defined which drugs needed a prescription. Because
Okay.
they weren't safe to just use on your own, you know.
You needed a doctor's guidance.
Right. So you see this gradual tightening of the rules, different aspects of drug safety, how they're used, all being addressed over time.
Step by step. Learning and adapting.
Exactly. Then, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, another really big thing happened.
Oh, no, not another tragedy.
I'm afraid so. The thalidomide tragedy.
What happened with that one?
This drug, thalidomide, it was being used a lot in Europe to help pregnant women with morning sickness.
That sounds helpful.
Except it caused severe birth defects. In thousands of babies, it was devastating.
Oh, that's terrible.
But here's the thing. Thalidomide caused all this harm in many countries, but it was never approved for widespread use in the United States.
Really? How did that happen?
It was largely thanks to an FDA medical officer, Dr. Frances Kelsey.
What did she do?
She insisted on more safety data before it could be approved. She was really cautious, and thank goodness she was.
Wow, that's an incredible story. So she potentially saved a lot of lives.
Absolutely. Her actions really highlighted how crucial it is to have that rigorous review process before a drug can be approved.
Right. And to have these regulatory agencies taking a really cautious approach.
Exactly.
So these historical events, they kind of set the stage for the regulatory landscape we have today.
They do.
So let's talk about those key players on the global scene. We mentioned the FDA.
Yes, the Food and Drug Administration, super important here in the U.S.
Huge. What all does the FDA oversee?
Their scope is really broad. It's not just pharmaceuticals.
Really? What else?
They also regulate biological products, medical devices, food, even cosmetics.
Wow. So they have their hands full?
They do. And when it comes to clinical trials for drugs and biologics, the FDA, they set the standards for how these studies should be designed, conducted, and how the results are reported.
Okay, that makes sense. And within the FDA's oversight, we often hear about GCP, good clinical practice. Can you remind us what that is exactly?
Sure, good clinical practice, GCP, it's like a set of rules, or really standards, international standards for ethical and scientific quality.
Right.
They cover everything, designing the trials, conducting them, recording data, and reporting the results.
Wow. Very comprehensive.
It is. And your source material, the clinical investigator training course transcript, it really emphasized how crucial GCP is.
How so?
Well, it ensures that the data from these clinical trials is reliable. And just as important, it protects the people participating in the studies.
Okay. Their safety, their rights, their well-being.
Exactly.
So it's good science and ethical treatment all rolled into one.
You got it.
And while the FDA is a big player in the U.S., you mentioned this is a global effort.
It is. We also have the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. They do similar work in the European Union.
Okay.
And then there's the WHO, the World Health Organization.
Right.
They set international standards and guidelines for health issues, including clinical research.
So a lot of international collaboration.
Definitely. We may not have all the details on the EMA and WHO right now,
Right.
but you always hear them mentioned when talking about these regulations.
It shows how important they are.
Exactly. They're all part of this big interconnected global system.
So there's a real push for consistency across the world.
There is.
And that brings us to those ICH guidelines.
Yes.
Can you remind us again what the ICH is and why their guidelines are so important?
Sure. ICH stands for the International Council for Harmonization.
Okay.
They're a really unique group. They bring together regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical industry experts
From all over the world.
from the US, Europe, and Japan, primarily.
Okay.
Their goal is to come up with harmonized guidelines for pharmaceutical products.
Basically to make the rules more similar across different regions.
Exactly. The idea is to streamline drug development
Yep.
and the process for registering new drugs to make it more efficient.
Okay, but without cutting corners on safety or quality, right?
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
So instead of companies having to navigate all these totally different rules in different countries,
Right.
the ICH is trying to create a more unified approach.
That's the goal. And one of the most important sets of guidelines they've developed is focused on good clinical practice.
That brings us back to ICH E6R2.
There you go. This guideline is a cornerstone. It provides a unified standard for how clinical trials should be conducted ethically and scientifically.
So no matter where in the world the trial is happening.
Exactly. The main goals of ICH E6R2 are to make sure trials are ethical, that the people participating are safe and their rights are protected,
That's crucial.
and that the data from the trial is high quality, trustworthy. So if a trial follows ICH E6R2, it means it meets a globally recognized standard.
For quality and ethical conduct.
Exactly.
That's good to know. ICH E6R2 is definitely a key standard to keep in mind.
It is. And keep in mind, ICH E6R2 is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right. There are so many other guidelines, right?
The ICH has developed guidelines covering a whole bunch of aspects related to pharmaceuticals, how they're developed, manufactured, everything.
Just to give us an idea, can you give us a quick overview of some of those other key ICH guidelines?
Sure, we have ICH Q7. It's all about good manufacturing practice for active pharmaceutical ingredients.
Okay, so for the actual drug substance itself.
Right. Then there's ICH Q8 R2, which focuses on pharmaceutical development. This one really stresses quality by design.
What does that mean, quality by design?
It means you build quality into the product and the manufacturing process right from the start. It's not an afterthought.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's ICH Q9. That one's all about quality risk management. It provides a system for identifying, assessing, and controlling any potential problems with quality.
Throughout the whole process, right?
Right, from beginning to end. Then we have ICH Q11. That one's all about picking the right starting materials, the stuff used to make the drug substance.
Okay, so making sure those ingredients are top-notch.
Exactly. And ICH Q4B, that one focuses on making sure different countries have consistent standards for drugs.
Oh, interesting.
We also have ICH M7, which sets limits for mutagenic impurities.
Mutagenic, meaning they could cause mutations in DNA.
That's right. And then there's ICH Q3A, which is all about impurities in new drug substances.
So setting thresholds for when impurities need to be controlled.
Exactly.
Wow, so there are a lot of guidelines. It really shows you how much goes into ensuring these medicines are safe and effective.
It does. It's a complex system, but it's all connected.
And you mentioned earlier that these regulations are constantly evolving.
They are.
Can you tell us more about that? How have they changed over time?
Well, as we talked about earlier with those historical events, these regulations aren't set in stone.
Right.
They've been updated and revised a lot over the years.
In response to what?
New scientific discoveries, for one thing. New technologies, too.
Makes sense.
And sadly, sometimes it takes a tragic event to highlight a gap in the system.
And then they have to make changes.
Exactly.
It's important to remember that different parts of the regulatory system, they all work together.
It's not just a bunch of separate rules.
Right.
They support each other.
Can you give us an example of how different regulations might connect?
Sure. Think about GMP, good manufacturing practices.
Okay.
Usually we think of GMP in terms of making the final drug product.
Right.
And there are specific regulations for that.
Like 21 CFR Part 211 for pharmaceuticals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even 21 CFR Part 111 for dietary supplements.
Okay.
But the basic principles of GMP, ensuring quality, preventing contamination, keeping good records.
Right.
Those are also crucial for clinical trials.
Because the way the drug is made and handled, that affects the results of the trial.
Exactly. So even though we have different sets of regulations for manufacturing and clinical trials, they both rely on those same core principles of quality.
That makes sense. You can't have a good clinical trial if the drug itself is not high quality.
Absolutely. And nowadays, clinical trials are relying more and more on computers.
Right. Everything is going digital.
So that's where regulations like 21 CFR Part 11 come in.
What's that one about?
That's the one about electronic records and electronic signatures.
Okay.
It sets requirements for making sure that the digital data in clinical research is trustworthy.
Makes sense.
It covers things like validating the systems, making sure there are audit trails so you can track any changes to the data.
So it's kind of like those qualification processes for lab equipment that they talked about in that YouTube video on GMP labs for dietary supplements.
Exactly. Those same principles apply to the electronic systems used in trials.
So with everything going digital, that's added a whole other layer of regulation.
It has. And the FDA wants to make sure everyone is actually following all these regulations.
Of course.
So they have this program called the Bioresearch Monitoring Program.
What do they do in that program?
They inspect clinical trial sites.
Like they go on site?
They do. And they audit the data.
To make sure everything is being done according to GCP.
And all the other relevant regulations, yes.
Wow. So they're actively checking up on the researchers.
They are. And there's this office within the FDA, the Office of Scientific Investigations, OSI.
Yeah.
They play a big role in these inspections. That came up in the FDA training course transcript.
So it's serious business.
It is. And there's a growing trend towards using risk-based approaches in clinical trials.
Risk-based approaches, what's that?
It means you're proactive. You identify potential risks early on.
Okay.
And you build quality into the study design from the very beginning, rather than just waiting for problems to happen and reacting.
So more preventative.
Exactly. Like that idea of quality by design we talked about earlier.
And is there much international collaboration when it comes to regulation?
Absolutely. Regulatory agencies around the world are sharing information and working together more and more.
I can see why that would be helpful.
It is. It helps to avoid duplicating work. and it helps to make sure the regulations are consistent across different countries.
Makes sense.
The FDA training course actually talked about some of these collaborations.
So it really is a global effort, all these agencies working together.
It is.
Now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the ethical aspects.
Okay.
How do these GCP principles and regulations actually ensure that the people volunteering for these trials are treated ethically?
That's a really important question. Ethical considerations are at the very heart of GCP.
Right.
It's not just about following rules.
It's about doing the right thing.
Exactly. And the regulations take these ethical principles and translate them into practical requirements. Things researchers have to actually do.
Okay.
One great example is informed consent.
Right. Making sure people understand what they're getting into.
Exactly. The regulations are very clear. You have to give potential participants all the information about the study. What's the purpose? What will happen during the trial? What are the risks? What are the benefits? What are their rights as participants?
Yeah.
All of that has to be explained before they decide whether or not to join.
It's about giving them the power to make an informed decision.
It is. And there's a specific form the FDA uses for this, the FDA 1572 form.
Okay.
The critical investigator has to sign this form, and it includes commitments about informed consent.
So they're legally bound to uphold those standards.
Right. And then there's the IRB, the Institutional Review Board.
What do they do?
They're an independent ethics committee. Their job is to review and approve the study protocol and all the other documents, too.
Like the informed consent forms?
Exactly. They make sure the study is ethically sound
Okay.
and that the risks to the participants are minimized, and they have to be reasonable
Reasonable compared to what?
compared to the potential benefits of the study
Yeah.
and the knowledge that might be gained.
So the IRB is like a watchdog, looking out for the participants' well-being.
They are. And they don't just review the study at the beginning, they keep an eye on it throughout the whole process.
To make sure things stay ethical.
Exactly.
What about vulnerable populations, like children or pregnant women?
The regulations have specific protections for them. There are extra safeguards to make sure they're not being exploited.
That's really important.
It is. And at the end of the day, the person in charge of the study, the clinical investigator, they have the ultimate responsibility
The what?
for the safety and well-being of the participants and for the integrity of the data.
So if anything goes wrong, it's on them.
It is. The FDA training course was very clear about that. Even if the investigator delegates tasks to other people on the study team, they're still the one who's ultimately accountable.
That's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And then there are rules about reporting adverse events.
Adverse events.
Any unexpected medical problems that happen during the trial,
Okay.
those have to be reported immediately to the appropriate authorities.
So that any potential safety issues can be addressed quickly.
Right. And of course, any other unanticipated problems also have to be reported.
So there's a lot of emphasis on transparency.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And the whole system is designed to make sure the safety of the participants comes first.
That's good to know. Now, let's talk about the data. All the information they gather during these trials.
Okay.
How do the regulations make sure that data is high quality and trustworthy?
That's a really important part of it, because that data, it's what they use to decide if a new treatment is safe and effective.
Right. It all comes down to the data.
It does. And the regulations have a bunch of requirements that are all about making sure that data is accurate and reliable.
Can you walk us through some of those key requirements?
Sure. One of the most fundamental principles is contemporaneous documentation.
Okay. Break that down for me. What does that mean?
It means all the data, it has to be recorded accurately. It has to be legible. You have to be able to read it. It has to be the original record of the observation. It has to be attributable, meaning you know who recorded it. And it has to be contemporaneous.
Contemporaneous.
Meaning it has to be recorded at the time the observation was made.
So no going back and filling things in later.
Right. You often hear these principles referred to as LCOA.
LCOA. What's that stand for?
Accurate, legible, contemporaneous, original, and attributable.
Okay, got it. What else?
Keeping good records and storing them properly, that's also crucial. There are regulations that specify exactly how long you have to keep those records.
How long is it?
Usually it's at least 2 years after the drug gets approved for marketing, or if the application is withdrawn,
Okay.
though it can vary a bit depending on what kind of product it is.
Right. So everything is documented and saved for a long time.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Exactly. It's all about having that clear audit trail.
What else?
Another big thing is sticking to the study plan, the protocol.
Right. You can't just change things up in the middle of the trial.
Exactly. The researchers have to follow the protocol exactly, and if they have to deviate from it, they have to document it and explain why.
Make sense?
And the people working on the trial, they have to be qualified.
Right. They need the right training and
Yeah,
expertise
absolutely. And we talked about validated systems earlier.
for electronic data capture.
Right. That's really important. It means making sure those systems are working properly, that they're reliable.
Like that YouTube video on using analytical instruments in a GMP environment.
Exactly. The same principles apply here. You need accurate and reliable tools to collect the data.
So it's about more than just the numbers themselves.
It is. It's about the processes, the people, everything that goes into making sure those numbers are actually meaningful.
Okay. What else is there?
There are rules about calibrating and maintaining the equipment, making sure it's all working properly, and there have to be clear procedures for dealing with any problems that come up.
So if something goes wrong, they have a plan.
Exactly. And they have to investigate thoroughly to figure out what happened. And the FDA training course mentions something else that's really important.
What's that?
People aren't allowed to share their logging credentials for the electronic data systems.
Oh, that makes sense. You have to know who entered what data.
Exactly. It's about accountability.
So all these requirements, they all work together to make sure the data is trustworthy.
They do.
It's a very thorough system.
It is. And it's constantly being refined and improved as science advances and new technologies come along.
It sounds like it's a never-ending process.
It is. But it's a really important one.
This has been incredibly informative. Can you sum up the key takeaways you'd want listeners to remember?
Sure. The world of clinical trial regulation, it's definitely complex,
That's for sure.
but it's essential. This framework, it's been built over many years, learning from mistakes, always with the goal of protecting people and making sure the research is ethical. Agencies like the SDA, the EMA, the WHO, they all play a huge role. And the ICH guidelines, they're a big part of making sure things are consistent globally.
Right, a unified approach.
Exactly. It's not just about following the rules, it's about maintaining public trust in medical research.
And ultimately, it's about protecting patients.
That's what it all comes down to.
I think that's a really good way to put it. It helps put everything into perspective.
I hope so.
So knowing all of this, what questions do you think our listeners should be asking? About clinical trials, about the regulatory process, anything like that?
Well, after this deep dive, I'd hope they'd be curious to learn more. Maybe delve deeper into some specific aspect of the regulations. There are so many resources out there.
Like where?
Well, all those regulations we talked about, those are publicly available. Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, that's a great place to start.
It's all online, right?
It is. So if anyone's really curious, they can go check it out, see what's really involved in bringing a new treatment to market.
That's a great tip. Thanks for walking us through all of this.
My pleasure.
I think our listeners are going to find this incredibly helpful.
I hope so. It's a fascinating topic, even if it can be a bit overwhelming at times.
Definitely. But I think we broke it down pretty well today.
I think so too.
All right, well, until next time, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.